because if you do that, okay, I'm going to call this meeting of the Audit Committee to order. It's just after 12, and I know Councillor Morgan is on his way. He'll just be a few minutes late arriving. I did want to say first that the City of London is committed to making every effort to provide alternate formats and communication supports for council, standing or advisory committee meetings and information upon request. To make a request for any city service, please contact accessibility@london.ca or 519-661-2489, extension 2425. I did also want to recognize we have 3 guests visiting us here today, Cairo, Owen, and Morgan. They're here for Take Your Kid to Work Day, and we sort of welcome to City Hall, and you've picked a great experience coming to the Audit Committee. It's one of the most important and exciting committees at the city. So we'll look to see if there's any disclosures of pecuniary interest. Councillor Turner.
I'll just no pecuniary interest. I will note that there's a couple mentions on the audit plan of the Middlesex London Health Unit, which is my employer, but no action identified within those.
Thank you. That brings us to the items for direction. We have a large number of internal audit matters, and I think we'll just go through them. We'll have just a presentation from the internal auditors, and then of course we'll open up to any questions that the committee might have. Go ahead.
Perfect. So if I can draw your attention to the internal audit dashboard dated October 28th, 2019. Just provide you with an update in terms of where we're at. You'll see within the package today, the parking enforcement assessment review has been completed, which we'll talk through. In terms of the Smart City Office pre-implementation assessment, that current project is slightly delayed based on the fact we're still waiting for an individual to be hired to be able to conduct that review. There has been initial conversations with management, and that's still ongoing. The electronic fund transfer compliance assessment, that review is currently on schedule, and we just met with management this morning actually to start talking through preliminary observations. The Dearness Home Process Assessment, that's ongoing, and that's on track to be completed in January. The IT Cyber Risk Workshop, that was completed in October, and the Computerized Maintenance Management System pre-implementation review has been kicked off, and that's currently a work in progress as we work through. In terms of the 2017-2018 audit plan projects that are still ongoing, we have the IT security assessment. That particular project is in discussions around the observations as well as reporting. So that should hopefully be ready for the next committee meeting. And the class replacement pre-implementation project is still ongoing as well too. In terms of our metrics, we would indicate as well too that things are working well with management in terms of being able to initiate the draft report, talk through management comments, as well as being able to get to the reporting stages. So no issues from that perspective. Are there any questions on the dashboard?
Colleagues, go ahead, Lori.
Thank you, through the chair. Just a question relating to the cyber risk workshop, and see that it's completed, and wondering more qualitatively, what was the outcome of that workshop? Were there any takeaways or next steps that may flow into a future internal audit plan? And I ask partially because just hearing on the news recently, the city of Woodstock was impacted, and there have also been impacts in healthcare with hospitals. So just wondering any follow-up actions or key learnings from that workshop.
Yeah, the workshops themselves were good in the sense that I think we scheduled an hour and a half, and it ended up going much over time. So there's lots of good interaction with the attendees at the committee. So that's more from the education and discussion side. I know our cyber expert, Kent Schramm, met with the IT management, and what they did is they went through some of their strategies more on an ad hoc basis. And they had some suggestions that I know that IT is working on to help refine their strategy from a cyber perspective. But from an internal audit perspective, we don't have any follow-ups at this point, but certainly we'll keep close to that. And I think the thought was that that may be something that we have on a more recurring basis, is to have those workshops. And those may highlight some items in the future.
Any other questions? Councillor Van Holst, go ahead.
Thank you. Just looking at the dashboard under the project customer satisfaction, was there a value for that? Or maybe I'm not reading the graph right. Maybe it's 5 and the objective is 4. Just looks like there's a bar graph with a value missing.
Currently, at this time, we've issued the satisfaction surveys. We just haven't received any results back. So we didn't feel it appropriate to include a value if we didn't receive anything from management.
Okay, well, thank you. That makes sense. It looks like a value was missing and it wasn't to be there. Thank you.
Okay, perhaps I could have a motion to receive the dashboard. Councillor Van Holst, seconded by Councillor Turner. Any discussion? All those in favor? Any opposed? That's carried.
Okay, I would now draw your attention to the observation summary. So since the last audit committee meeting, internal audit was able to close 1 high priority observation for the housing process assessment. We closed 2 medium priority observations within the building permit process assessment, and also 1 within management compensation. So you'll see from the observation summary, management compensation process assessment, all the observations have been closed. So that report is now complete. And there is a total of 2 medium priority observations which are past due as of October 28th, compared to 4 that were past due from our last meeting in August. We have had conversations with management. Their action plans are underway, and there's no issues at this point to report.
Any questions about the observation summary report? Okay, is there a motion to receive that? Councillor Turner, Councillor Van Holst. Let's wait for Councillor Morgan. Have a seat. Welcome to Audit Committee, Councillor Morgan. As you'll see, we have 3 guests over on your right. We're here for Take Your Kid to Work Day. We are on item 4.3, which is the observation summary. Just wondering if you have any questions about that. Okay. It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor? Any opposed? It's carried.
So I would ask, would you like to go through the parking enforcement assessment internal audit report before we move into the internal audit plan? Do you have?
Sounds like a good idea to me. I know we have some folks who are here specifically to speak to that. I think just in behind you. So why don't we do that now?
Perfect. So if I draw your attention to the parking enforcement assessment report, so a part of our internal audit plan was to look at the contracting for parkman enforcement. Management had put their hand up because they indicated and they knew that this particular area would be going to RFP and there would be a revision of a new contract. So they asked Deloitte to be able to look at what are some of those leading practices and best practices within that area. So as they move into the contracting stage, they'd be able to ensure that the right controls and the right metrics were put in place. And that's why you'll see within this particular review, we have 9 leading practice observations and 1 low priority, because it's more in lines of when management goes to tender, they're going to be updating their contract accordingly with the leading practices as they see fit. Within this particular review as well, we had done some benchmarking that was performed against the 2017 MBNA Canadian Bylaw Enforcement Report, and there was a laundry list of different cities that were involved within that benchmark. So just to name a few in terms of what we looked and assessed the city against there was Regina, Sudbury, Calgary, Halifax, Hamilton, Montreal, Saskatoon, Thunder Bay, Toronto, Windsor, and Winnipeg. So those municipalities were taken into perspective as we looked at this particular project as well. In terms of the key strengths for this area, we found that management did have a strong process in place around monitoring contract compliance. They had extensive internal and external communications around the contract. They were very focused on cost management and also in terms of ensuring that they had the right key contract terms and conditions as well too. Now, I know that there is a laundry list of leading practice recommendations, so I'm going to go on the assumption that you read the report, and I'd open it up to any questions.
I think a good assumption for the members of this committee, that people have read it, and I'm just looking to see if there's any questions for internal auditors about these recommendations. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, my question is through you to our staff. Do we have the knowledge, training, or resources necessary to implement all the leading practices that have been suggested?
Yes, through the chair, we certainly do. We actually asked for this audit to be done because for the past 30 years, this has been a sole source contract, well before my time in parking. However, moving forward, we are going to go through a process of RFQ and RFP because we know that there's competition in the field for parking enforcement. We actually do our own sort of internal secret shopper audits where we park vehicles and we complain against ourselves, checking on response time, checking on accuracy of the tickets, and we work very closely with our contractor, advising them on some of the issues that we see through our own internal audits. So there's a number of good KPIs that have been suggested by our auditor, and we would be incorporating them in future RFQs.
Okay, thank you. Secret shopper. There was somebody parked in front of my house in a non-parking spot today with an orange vest on. Was I supposed to report them? I know I'm just joking. Thank you.
Just getting back to the internal audit. Any other questions? Councillor Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The recommendations on contract management, I think, are well heeded and seem to make a lot of sense. As I go through those, it kind of sparked a question in me to wonder how incorporated are those practices in all of our contract management, whether it's parking or other things. And perhaps that's a question for staff. If I'd imagine, as in reviewing these, that opportunity exists for us to apply those in other service areas as well. But perhaps they're already employed to some varying extents. So I guess my question is, are we, and what can we do to help incorporate those where it's not being done presently?
Through the chair, I can speak to the other contract that we're responsible for, and that's animal services. We certainly have KPIs in those. You would be familiar with the live release rate of 90% for animals, for cats and dogs. So we're currently sitting at about 95% live release rate. So that's an example of animal services where we do incorporate a KPI right into the contract discussions.
Go ahead.
Thank you, through the chair. So a large number of these, earlier this year, actually, Deloitte had done the construction procurement audit as well. So a number of these things, I believe, were also reflected in some of that audit, and a large number, this is certainly, I mean, there's some that are specific to parking, but there's many others that are also specific to the things that we do in hand. So certainly, we've had a tremendous movement toward KPIs wherever possible, and trying to really look at some good metrics to make sure that we're moving forward, that the contracts are being done, and that we're getting what we want out of them. So certainly as things come due and we start going forward, we look at trying to enhance them each and every time, and if there's another step that we can do. So these are certainly best practices that we already try to employ, and that we, each and every opportunity, we try to take another review of them to see if there's anything else that can be enhanced as well.
Great, thank you. Yes, some of these things make sense, especially in the KPIs. Some may be more in practice in other areas, such as change orders. And the ability to do change midstream on a contract, which probably would exist a lot more in our civic works procurements than it would be in provision of services on contracted services, which I think when you're doing constructions, change orders are just one of those things in general, right? So they're very helpful. So I appreciate that. Thanks.
Any other discussion on this? Councillor Van Holst?
Thank you. So the, the recommendation that was marked in the graph as most complex was 2.01, and suggesting that we add into the contract performance indicators and perhaps incentives, et cetera. So I'm just asking through you to our staff which ones, or even to our auditors, which performance indicators we'll be considering for that.
Through the chair, we're going to give consideration to KPIs such as response times to calls, attendance in problems areas, so specifically in school zones. We just implemented the AMPS system on last Friday, so we are at school zones currently. We did some initial education on that. Cancellation rates is another KPI that we want to look at closely, number of tickets canceled due to officer error. So there's a whole list of them, and we'll be incorporating them in the future RFQ.
Thank you.
I don't see any other discussion. I did want to say, just from the chair, I think this is a very well-timed area to be looking at. I seem to recall last time we dealt with this contract, I may have voted against it because I wasn't too happy with the price that came back. And I think these kind of changes are helpful as we go out to RFQ and to see what we can get in the market. So I want to say thanks to the internal auditors for the report and also for management identifying this as an area to focus on. I think it's been really helpful. Hopefully we get great result in the next contract. I have a mover for the report. There you go, Councillor Van Holst, seconder. Councillor Morgan, thank you. All those in favor? Any opposed? Carried. So that brings us back to the internal audit plan for 2020 and beyond.
So in terms of the internal audit plan, our objectives within the plan for 2020 was to really assist the audit committee and SLT in fulfilling your overall oversight responsibilities, as well as to be able to provide independent, objective audit and advisory, and also value-added recommendations to the various areas. The process that we followed this year to be able to update the plan is we spent time with the senior leadership team going over the initial projects, talking about priorities, and from a risk perspective, what would be the right projects to bring forward. So if I can just draw your attention to page 15 within the plan, we'll be able to take you through the various projects that we had landed on from discussion. The one point that I wanted to mention is you'll see that we do indicate FY 2021 and 2022. These are just meant to be a repository of projects that as we revisit the plan next year, we'll use this as the starting point with management to see if there's still areas that we should be focusing on our time or if there's new projects that should be swapped in. So for the purposes of today, I'd like to just focus on the 2020, but we wanted you to be aware of what some pending projects could look like. So in terms of the internal audit universe area from a solicitor perspective, we have within the plan the clerk's office assessment. Here we want to spend some time looking at the efficiency and effectiveness as well as the value for money that is being achieved within those various processes. We're going to spend some time looking at the operational as well as the management oversight controls within that area. It's an area that we haven't audited in the past, and management feels it would be worthwhile to take a look at. If we turn the page, the next area that's within the plan is we just wanted to highlight for you is that there will be the ongoing project from the 2019 plan, which is the Smart City Strategy implementation, with the delay in terms of hiring the resource that's needed to be able to execute. We do see this project running into the next year's timeline as well. The other area is within engineering. We're going to be spending some time looking at the traffic management project review. Here, we're going to evaluate the proposed scope, the user requirements, as well as the established strategy that'll be in place, and be able to ensure that, that the right scope is being achieved through that particular review. The next area on page 17 is we will have, again, another ongoing project around the computerized maintenance management system. Just because this review is a pre-implementation review, we will follow the review from start to finish until that particular system is up and running. So again, we will be reporting on this within 2020, and it will be taking up management's time as well, too. The next area is fire. Within this area, we are going to look at a process assessment where we're going to spend time looking at operational and financial processes, as well as focusing in on the data reporting and monitoring of key performance indicators. The next area will be Service London. Again, within this review, it will be looking at the operational and the financial processes. And then again, within Parks and Recreation, we still have the class replacement project that will be ongoing until it is implemented within the city. So these are just very high-level process descriptions. Once the plan is approved, we will spend time with management to scope out those particular areas, be able to drill in on more of the high-risk areas, and that'll shape the audit as well. So at this time, I'd welcome any questions that you may have.
Questions about the audit plan for 2020 to 2022, especially the 2020 parts? Councilor Turner.
Thank you, and thanks for the summary. The questions I had, I guess, it's kind of a few, but with respect to the clerk's office and the fire review, fire process assessments, both of those have a fairly significant amount of legislative requirements within their service areas. Will there be a component that kind of assesses the performance against those legislative requirements, or to ensure that there are controls in place that those requirements are met?
When we had the initial scoping discussion with management, we'll discuss with them what their processes are to be able to validate compliance with the legislations. We'll understand if there is a potential risk area and if we need to be able to spend some time within that particular item to look at compliance, and also be able to, depending on how the scope shapes out, to look at what legislation would fall within the scope of the review. So I wouldn't necessarily say at this point we would touch on all areas of legislation. It would just be those more prudent to what we agree upon from a scope perspective.
Thank you. That's helpful, especially I think the potential to miss a legislative mandate presents a risk to the corporation, and so from the risk-based perspective that these audits are taking, I think that's a really important area that we focus on. And recognizing that you were primarily focused on fiscal year 2020, my eye kind of glances towards the other ones a little bit too, but the two ones that kind of concern me a little bit as being far out at fiscal year 2022 were the emergency planning process review and the industrial community improvement plan incentives. The CIP component there, for every year that we wouldn't make adjustments to, that has a carryover effect through our budget in a couple of years. So doing it earlier would probably have a more beneficial impact on our budgeting. And with the emergency planning process, especially with respect to business continuity and disaster recovery, again, from a risk perspective, I'm not sure of the maturity of our business continuity processes within the corporation. I'd imagine they're fairly robust and would have to be. So if they are, then it's probably appropriate at that time. But if there's a staff sense that they could use a bit more, I I guess, more rigor, then it might be something that we would considered having a little earlier, because again, the risk of not having well-established business continuity practices puts the corporation and its processes and services at risk from interruption.
Anyone want to respond?
Sorry, the next two columns in the plan, those are good feedback that we'll take notes for next year's planning. I think this, unless you feel that it should be moved into the upcoming year, I think the process would be to consider it as part of the planning process for next year and possibly move it ahead if they feel that it's a higher risk than the other projects that are selected for the coming year.
I did see Ms. Livingston reaching for the mic. Go ahead.
Thank you, through the chair. I just wanted to respond on the business continuity aspect. We've been on this mission quite significantly for the last few years. It's extremely detailed work, so I feel fairly confident that we've done a lot of that work. So I'm comfortable with this timeline, but hear the feedback, and when we meet from a management perspective, we can talk about whether it should move up a year or not.
It's helpful and reassuring. At work, I'm responsible for overseeing the business continuity stuff in one of the teams in my division, so recognize the importance of that within any organization. I'm hesitant to recommend moving something forward at this point, but I'm glad to hear that it would be considered for the next one. The industrial CIPs is one that that if there were cost savings to be achieved, I think it's better to realize those earlier than later, as it kind of has a multiplier effect through the years that it's not done. So that would be just my comments, I think, more than anything.
Councillor Van Holst.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Had a couple questions about the audit universe. I noticed that in the agencies, boards, commissions, and corporations, we also have a Hamilton Road business improvement area and a Hyde Park business improvement area, and they weren't on that list. I was wondering if there was a reason for that. They were left out or just haven't made it onto the list yet because they're fairly new.
It's the latter. Yeah, they were created after we started the audit plan, right? So they're very, like Hyde Park would have just come into existence at the time that it was being set, because we're carrying forward from the previous year. So the sort of categories on the side were set quite a while ago, actually, probably 2018 when the plan is starting to be developed to get going into 2019. So I think that's the reason. They should probably be added just so we're keeping track.
Okay, so that would be my suggestion then. And looking in corporate services too, under economic innovation, there's a little space. There's 3 things and a space for another one. I'd be interested in having revenue generation put in there under economic innovation. That seems like something we've talked about in our strategic plan, and it'd be interesting if that appeared somewhere. My other question was regarding the 2020 audit plan. In the clerk's office, we're looking to assess the effectiveness and efficiency. That's great. This is also a very customer-facing department. I'm wondering if customer satisfaction will be a part of this as well, or could it be, or do we do that are we evaluating that in another process?
From conversations with management, when we scope it, customer service will always fall under the operational aspects within a given unit. So I'll make note that customer service is an area of maybe possibly discussion or concern from an audit committee perspective. When we look to scope it, we can do a little bit more dialogue around what that process looks like.
It'd be wonderful. Thank you.
Any other questions about the audit plan? I'll go to Ms. Higgs and then Councillor Morgan.
Thank you. Just a few comments and then through the chair, some questions as well. So to start with a comment, I wanted to support Councillor Turner's comment around the emergency planning and would support seeing that moved forward. And I did observe, I kind of went back to the April plan that was presented to the audit committee, and that particular one previously did reside in 2021. And that leads to some of my questions around the overall 3-year plan as we saw it in April and in comparison to the one that's presented today. On an overall basis, I've noted 8 items that are deferred. So they were either initially planned for 2020 or 2021, and they've now been pushed out to 21 or 22. So just some commentary around the rationale or the process you go through to make a decision to defer from our April meeting to this meeting. And then I've also observed that 2 items that were on the April plan have been removed in their entirety. And I may be more interested in how decisions are made to remove items. And the 2 that were removed were in fiscal year 20, we'd previously planned to look under the planning area around resiliency, planning, governance, and monitoring. So that's one that I'm no longer seeing in the 3-year plan. And the other one that appears to have been removed was previously slated for 2021, and it was in the engineering department relating to a strategic investment project. So high level, just interested in your comments on rationale and process for deferral of items, as well as how items get removed from the plan.
So within Appendix B of the internal audit plan, you'll see our rationale for why given projects are included. So when we spend time talking to management as well as being able to do our own assessment of the risk areas, we look at these 5 criteria. If it's a key inherent business risk to the organization, if it's been suggested by the audit committee, if it's an area to take a look at, if it's been raised by management as an area of concern, also the alignment with the key initiatives that the city is undertaking, as well as your strat plan and what are those key areas you want to focus on within the given year. And then also we have the category of not audited recently. So as we work through our criteria of what's to be included within the plan, we'll look at those 5 areas of rationale and then also be able to look at it from a budget perspective, because there is a limit in terms of the internal audit budget and how many different projects can be created within a given year. We'll have the conversations with management to be able to have an understanding of what's management doing, what's on their radar. If we find in a given area that management has initiatives underway to already be able to make improvements or to make changes to a given area, or also too, sometimes you may have other individuals coming into the city auditing a particular area, that would give rise to why a project might be deferred or removed from the plan as well too. So we would have had conversations with management around the resiliency as well as the strategic investment projects. And at this time, there was a determination and an agreement that from a risk perspective, the city's money would be better spent on the projects we've included in 2020.
Just a follow-up comment, thanks. That does help in terms of the inclusion rationale. And I guess I reflect on, if we go back to April, at that time, those 2 projects presumably would have met the criteria for risks. So cost constraint, budget constraint is one element. And I guess, am I hearing that it's the cost constraint that has removed them? And is the risk profile still the same that drove them to be included on the April plan? So that's something I'm still wondering about. And perhaps for future reports, if there are changes from one forecasted plan to another, it might be helpful to just highlight, here are the key changes from plan A to plan B, and high level why those items have changed or been removed, so that we can understand whether it is the risk profile has decreased because new controls were put into place, or we simply don't have the resources to execute.
I think I have Councillor Morgan next. Is there anyone want to comment at all on that? It was more of a comment, but Councillor Morgan.
Yes, I want to pick up on something that Councillor Turner raised, because I had the same thought when I read the report, and that's on the industrial community improvement plan incentives. I recognize that this is fiscal year 2022 in the plan. However, anytime I see the value for money audits that assess our incentive programs and reviewing the potential for adjusting them based on their effectiveness, it seems to me that Councilor Turner's right. The sooner we do that, the more benefits that are realized sooner on if adjustments are made, particularly if they're financial adjustments. And so I'm curious about, you know, the ability of moving that up in the plan. I know that there's an option to do that when we set next year to move it up a year, but that one in particular, and then on that particular audit, in the thinking about that one, to me, it would be a little bit difficult to isolate the community improvement plan component of the industrial incentives without considering the impacts of tax ratios and land servicing and the other industrial incentives in the space that may create, their own incentives for industrial development. So with the value for money piece on that one, I think there's some thinking about it, as well as the potential to move it up if there's the potential for it to lead to some savings. I'd rather have those savings or adjustments sooner rather than later. So that's my comment on that, and I appreciate Councillor Turner raised that. The other thought I had on the risk framework is, I know a lot of these are reputational risk, pretty much comes up in everyone. And then there are also a number that we'd be reviewing that are citizen satisfaction risk. And my question is, I understand the audit process, but do we ever layer the results of, say, citizen satisfaction surveys into the process of determining whether there are changes with the satisfaction of a particular service, or I'm just wondering how that gets layered in when that's one of the risks that we're assessing in a different way? Because we do have that, satisfaction survey on different components of the organization. And if that's one of the risks, and oddly, citizen satisfaction actually is kind of a sub-risk of the reputational risk, in that, if we don't act with integrity, people will be dissatisfied with us. So it seems to me like there's something there, and I'm curious on how that would get layered in to the assessment process, if at all.
We don't currently consider that as part of the audit planning, but it is a good point that maybe we should at least consider it for review as part of the audit planning in the future.
I wanted to return just briefly to the point that Ms. Higgs raised earlier, which is to have sort of the changes, if there are changes between the plans, different iterations, that those be highlighted. I think if we just had a motion to that effect, it would give a little direction to the auditors to do that in the future. I think they probably would anyway, just having heard the feedback, but if we formalize it, I think that's probably a good idea. The clerk, I think, has drafted up a little bit of language. I imagine you'd like to move that. Is there a seconder for that? Councilor Van Holst, okay. Any discussion about that? Go ahead.
Thank you. I think that's consistent with what we do with our deferred items on our other committees. When things come and go from those lists, we usually discuss that at the committee, so it's nice to know that something is no longer on our list, rather than just have them fall off without us knowing. Or
since we don't have the benefit of a lot of screens that we can look at, I wonder if the clerk perhaps read the language so everyone knows what it says. Okay, or I'll do it, yeah. That the following changes be made to the 2020-2022 internal audit plan. In fact, it includes the other piece that Councillor Van Holst observed, that the BIAs were not included, so we'll have the Hyde Park with an E. BIA and Hamilton Road be added to the audit universe, just so we're keeping track of those other local boards. And the revenue generation be added to economic innovation section in the corporate services audit universe. That was a bit of a separate idea that Councillor Van Holst brought up with. That's been added as a part B. And then part C, that any changes to the audit plan be identified to the audit committee. So just so we're tracking that piece, if something is deferred or dropped, that be highlighted. So Ms. Higg, I was looking to really get the third part there, which is the changes to the other part, adding in the BIAs, I think is relatively straightforward. Do you want to move all three of those things? Yeah. Okay, all three of those things have been added. Still seconded by Councillor Van Holst, yeah. Any discussion on those three things? All those in favor? Any opposed? That's carried. One thing I will say, we've just finished the agenda, but I will say on the issue of the CIPs and the grants, I seem to recall that we did have a direction to staff to come back on those things separate from the audit. And I don't know if Ms. Barbone wants to weigh in that, but the downtown CIP, DC grants, and also the industrial, there's something that's coming into the budget process related to those things, and I didn't want to lose track of that because I think that's also happening, and maybe Ms. Barbone wants to address it.
Yes, thank you, through the chair. We have a resolution outstanding from the July meeting that we reported on back on some of the pieces, but the specific industrial and downtown CIP with the resolution is with a consideration for a reduced level of subsidy. So that work is currently underway and scheduled to come back in December of this year. So to go in and audit it after the fact is a little bit premature. So this is really trying to look at the long term once we get some changes in established program. One of the other things that was also outstanding is also to look specifically with at least the downtown about what point, how do we know when we're successful and when to stop, so that when Deloitte were to come in and look at that, they could actually evaluate a true program. Right now, in isolation of some of that work, there'd be very little to audit in terms of just going through. So we're trying to set it up so that there is more information with which to look at, knowing that we're already looking at that right now and have been with some changes that have occurred over the last number of years with the changes to fund those programs accordingly. So we are coming back shortly with that, and then based on whatever decision is made through the budget process, there will be some time for that to take effect and then subsequently an audit. So there's still potential to move it up, but certainly that work's underway right now.
I thought that'd be helpful for members of the committee. Great discussion as always. Motion to adjourn. Councilor Van Hol, seconded by Councilor Turner. All those in favor? That's carried. Thank you very much for another good audit committee meeting, and thank you to our guests for joining.